Our lives in this world are all a bit problemed, and one of the problems that certainly does affect us is the constant challenge of decision in relation to the various events and circumstances which arise every day. Sincere people want to make correct decisions. They want to feel that their way of life bears some relation to the integrities which they hold to be important. In trying to relate ourselves to the common patterns in which we live, we are constantly required to define in some way the proper place of the individual in the group. We feel that there is some kind of a basic virtue in not merely drifting with collective conditions. We like to feel also that regardless of our circumstances, our abilities, or our debilities, we are individuals. And we know that we have certain rights. One of these rights is that of individual decision. Very often, however, this privilege or right or duty becomes so obscured and so complicated by circumstances that it no longer seems that we have the right to make the decisions which we feel to be important. In moments of this kind, several courses lie open to us. One is to strengthen the individuality in ourselves so that we shall have greater control of circumstances. Another is to attempt to weigh whether or not we are supposed to control circumstances, and to what degree we can be ourselves and do the things we believe to be right without entering into conflict with other persons and other conditions. Today, our life is so complicated that clear-cut, simple, direct decision is now comparatively rare. Nearly every problem that we face opens a number of alternate courses of action. And about these we must come to some fair and reasonable conclusion. So the question of our individuality looms large because everyone else is desperately trying to be an individual. And in our struggle for independence, we are constantly burdened with the problem of our interdependence. We are not actually in a position, in most cases, to do exactly as we please, or even as we believe to be right, without interfering with the pleasures and privileges of other individuals like ourselves. This subject has been of moral and ethical and spiritual significance since the dawn of history. And various extreme attitudes about this have always been marked with some kind of stress, tension, and sorrow. So this morning we want to try to analyze a little bit the relationship of the individual to those things around him, to clarify, if possible, some reasonable course of procedure. The person is an individual, yet this individuality which he possesses is itself incomplete, imperfect, and usually immature. It means that what we call our own individual nature is actually a complex of conflicting elements and factors. We find it increasingly difficult to make up our own minds, and very difficult to bring our mental and emotional conclusions together. One of the reasons for the discord around us is the disunity within us. And our inconsistency, which is a common fault, stems inevitably from the fact that we are not able to judge and estimate with a sufficient degree of accuracy. We do try, but our uncertainty stems from our unknowing and from the realization that we are not necessarily right. By the time our friends who want it otherwise continue to impress upon us that we are not right, and that anything that we do contrary to their wishes is improper, we are completely confused. We cannot move with certainty unless we move from certainties in our own natures. Now, certainties, like everything else in our living, are relative. We are not in a position to know what the certainties of tomorrow and next year will be. We are quite convinced that we are growing creatures, and that tomorrow we should have better insight than we have today. This being the natural outlook, we can always judge ourselves in the terms of the fact that by tomorrow our judgment may require change. Other people around us try to convince us that they live in our tomorrows, know much more about these things than we do, and thus force their decisions upon us. We may also take the same course. And in each instance, there is a certain amount of lack of insight. We overestimate or we underestimate. We think we are better than we are, or we overlook our own faults too completely. And thus our decisions lack integration. They lack clarity of purpose. And we are considered appropriately modest people if we admit this in the first place. We have to admit it. Yet in the presence of such admission, we must still make decision and adjustment with the faculties and powers available to us. This means that it is usually wrong to be too adamant in an attitude. It is also not advisable for us to force our position beyond what is reasonable, natural, and to a degree revocable. It is much better that our decisions should not be so terminal in their nature that it is impossible for us to change. We often get into our most serious troubles by trying to be consistent with our own past decisions. This means that the individual who overestimates himself is going to be confronted constantly with the need to defend imperfect, inadequate opinions and attitudes. It is therefore wise not to place ourselves where such becomes too necessary. In the defending of our old mistakes, we make new ones, and by degrees involve our lives in so much confusion that its natural optimism is destroyed. In these things, the wise of all time have suggested moderation. Yet moderation also is a peculiar and dangerous word. To most people, moderation suggests limitation, frustration, or negation. The moderate person seems to be one who is not using all of his resources. He is a person apologizing for his own action before he performs it. This is held to be lack of courage, lack of strength. Yet positive moderation is in many instances the final proof of courage. for it causes the individual to move from his own rational position rather than from the pressures of his thoughts and emotions. Moderation is a very difficult position to maintain. For the person to be moderate has to estimate accurately his own abilities and debilities. He has to recognize the degree in which he is probably correct, and he has to have a full and clear understanding of his own limitations. He must know those things which he does not know. He must recognize them and must be prepared to allow them to play their parts in the decisions which he makes. Thus, individuality is something that we must investigate in our own natures. Assuming that we are individuals and have individual rights and prerogatives, we must sometime estimate what we mean when we refer to ourselves in this way. If we are individuals, what is this individual compound composed of? We know that all individuality is a degree of separateness. It means that in certain respects we must be different. And individuality is based upon difference. Difference in itself, if overemphasized, becomes the cause of strife. Yet we want to be an individual. We want a right to think from our own differences, and yet to get along together with a degree of amity, as much amity as possible. One way to accomplish this, of course, is to remove the sense of belligerence from difference, so that we can differ without taking offense or taking an offensive position toward others. The right to be different is the problem that faces world organizations today. We are confronted with the tremendous conflict between, for instance, independence and interdependence. And we are now of the opinion that we cannot be a free people unless at the same time we unite in principles with persons who do not agree with us. Thus, the protection of our own right to be an individual depends upon our acceptance of the right of others to be individuals. And here's where we get into our gravest trouble. To us, individuality means that we are always right and the other person is always wrong. We must get out of this and recognize that so-called right and wrong in many problems is merely similarity and difference. To the degree that others are similar, we assume that they are right. To the degree that they are dissimilar, we assume that they are wrong. If dissimilarity is too great, so that there is no longer any obvious sympathy, then we have complete misunderstanding or total lack of understanding. Thus, our problem is to accommodate to the dissimilar and to recognize that dissimilarity is not a problem of morals. Dissimilarity is not an estimation of right and wrong. It is an estimation of the patterns, the basic patterns underlying life. The powers creating the universe and fashioning man in the beginning apparently wished things to be dissimilar. As a result, the universe is composed of an incalculable number of dissimilars. Things in themselves individual but different from other things. In the universe, however, this dissimilarity is enclosed within a tremendous unity. The dissimilarity is independence. The vast unity in which it exists is interdependence. all things deriving their life and survival from a common source, are not prevented by that source from unfolding individual aspects and attributes. And it is this individuality that gives beauty, contrast, color, vitality, and meaning to human and natural experiences. Thus we certainly are richer in our aesthetic values, because all trees are not alike, all flowers are not the same, all scenery is not the same. We are richer because of these differences. But scenery and flowers and sunsets do not become involved too much in our living for the most part. We accept them so naturally that we do not enter into conflict with them. We have conflict with the weather occasionally, when it rains, when we want to do something. But in a conflict of that kind, we have an instinctive realization that we have lost before we begin the fight. So we do not struggle very greatly. We accept it as something beyond our control. So we have an acceptance towards universal differences. We are patient under the adversities which they seem to cause. And we make no great claim to injustice because it rains when the day we wish to do something that calls for a sunshiny day. But in the dispositions and climates of our associates, we do not have this process of acceptances. If someone asks why, we have quite a good answer for them. Namely, that these climatic differences in dispositions become aggressive. We cannot adjust to them as easily as we can to nature. And most of all, we have a feeling that nature is right, and we have an instinctive feeling that our friends and neighbors are wrong. And it is much easier to adjust to something sent by providence than it is to get along with individuals who seem to merely have cussed dispositions of their own. Yet in a strange and wonderful way, all dispositions are also gifts of providence of some kind. They represent individuals moving from the degrees of attainment or infirmity within themselves. They recognize values that we also have to examine. The possibility of interdependence still remains and looms large. And somewhere we have to cut a Gordian knot. We have to make some kind of a basic decision. Actually, those around us are not only influenced by the pressures within themselves, but they are all influenced by the resistances within others. Nearly always, a difficult disposition is a compound not only of the individual's nature, but of the effect of this nature upon his environment. It is not only the person, but the pressures placed upon him that have a tendency to disfigure and deform him. Most individuals in a relaxed state, when not under tension, reveal a moderate degree of cooperation. The moment, however, they are assailed, the moment they are pressed, their dispositions disintegrate. And the pressure that we exert upon others is as difficult an element in this compound of relations as the influence which they exert upon us. Somewhere in this pattern of things, someone has to be as right as possible. And if instead of attempting to win, we would attempt to establish rightness somewhere in this compound, we might observe that the tensions of other people are also reduced, and we find it easier to live with them and their problems because we have achieved a state in which it is easier for us to live with ourselves. So we are constantly confronted with a series of decisions which sometimes we feel take the form of self-sacrifice. We are expected to give up our points of view in order to maintain peace. We have no proof that it will do so. It merely constitutes a continuance of an uncertain and incomplete truce, which is liable to be broken at any moment. We also experience the fact that the moment we begin to give in, we are invited to continue this policy. And having once apparently become easy, we feel that everyone will impose upon us. And many times they do so. So the important situation of trying to get a safe and secure center from which to move and by which we can approach other things, this is a very serious and important situation today. Everyone is faced with it, and everyone has got to try in some way or other to work through it. All right, we will then assume for the moment, and for the moment only, that the only point of breaking a vicious circle or a difficult situation is to work upon ourselves. The only person we can actually change is ourselves. Also, all the change that is possible to us has to arise in our relationships with other things. We look out upon nature, we cannot change nature. We look out upon great human collectives, and we realize that we cannot change these. Long experience tells us that we have great difficulty, almost an impossible situation, in trying to change the opinions and attitudes of 3 or 4 intimate associates. Thus, the possibility to achieve our end by forcing our own conclusion upon any other creature is remote, leads to disillusionment and despair, and exhausts our own resources and energies in struggle against the inevitable. This battle of the individual against the group must ultimately always lead to defeat. And the world is full of persons whose energies have been destroyed and whose lives have been shortened in this valiant but meaningless struggle against patterns and situations over which the individual has no legitimate control. The only area in which control is possible is that part of nature which is directly under the dominion of our own consciousness, and that is ourselves, and the nature and compound of which we are composed. The problem then is to determine, if we can, how to approach the reduction of tension and stress without compromising principles and without placing ourselves in a position in which we have destroyed the initiative which we require for life. Every individual, to live well, must live with a certain measure of enthusiasm. It may be a quiet, genteel enthusiasm or a more boisterous kind, but without a kind of glow, without a sense of meaning, a sense of joy in the basic values of life, the individual soon finds himself turning into a neurotic. Therefore, to keep the joy there, to keep it in our own name, so that someone else cannot take it away from us, and yet with it all, not to develop or build defense mechanisms that will destroy another part of our natures. This is a fine matter of decision, and usually requires study, thoughtfulness, and understanding. Actually, our great structure of learning whether it be in the sciences, the philosophies, or the religions. This structure is essentially intended to serve that purpose. The purpose of all learning is that the individual shall understand himself, and from this understanding shall be able to make constructive relationships with other selves also endowed with understanding. Thus, understanding reveals interdependence. Understanding unites us upon a level higher than our differences, and at the same time does not damage our individuality. In many, many respects, we know every day that individuality is not dangerous. We realize constantly that it is an essential element in our entire way of life. The individuality of our tastes, in the selection of things we wish to use in making our homes more beautiful. Our individuality in dress and in thought and in arts and sciences. Our selections of activities that are particularly fitting to our natures. All these individualities are not destructive. They are sanctioned by society. They are encouraged by society. Why they're encouraged, we won't go into at the moment. Perhaps the encouragement adds something to the commonwealth. But in any event, these things are not regarded as antisocial. Those parts of our individualities which get us into trouble are those in which, in some way, we come to the conclusion that our own attitude is more valuable, more important, and more necessary than the attitudes of others. In our lives, this is so. In their lives, it may not be so. And the things we want people to do would seldom, if ever, make them happy. The pleasure would be the pleasure it gives us watching them do it, because they are then fulfilling our requirements. In this way, we all play demigods, or try to. And having gotten away from our proper perspective, we discover suddenly that as deities we are a dismal failure. That as people we might have a great deal in our favor, but when we lose our levels, we then lose our abilities to be valuable, helpful, and cooperative. So we start in by trying to estimate the meaning of individuality, why we have it, and how we can use it to common and constructive good. Our individuality is the conspiracy of a whole group of faculties and powers. It arises not only from our own reaction to things seen and heard, but also our internal perpetuation of experience and conduct patterns. It may arise partly in race. It may arise in location. It may arise in time. For the moment we place any kind of boundary upon the universal, we individualize it. Humanity is a collective, a group. But the moment we speak of the Greek or the Roman, we have individualized it. Various attitudes on all levels are brought into focus by the individualizing of time. When we talk of man, we say a universal. When we speak of 18th century man, then we have immediately localized and individualized him. So the moment we subject him to any kind of a reference frame, his individuality stands out. And for the most part, this individuality stands out in terms of his abilities or his debilities. Generations are better than and worse than others, but humanity contains them all and must function through the tremendous challenge which they represent. So we try to apply learning to the creation of the moderate individual. We say that this individual must analyze his relations to life, his basic values, and the degree into which he can depend upon the growth of his own nature. Some persons have been very successful in this type of thing by simply sitting down and diagramming themselves. There are three ways in which you can do this. One is to diagram your total nature. Analyze it as you might analyze a sentence in grammar. Study the various relationships of the parts thereof. Take the area in which you function, and using some basic quantity as representing normalcy, try to decide to what degree you vary from this norm, either in excess of it or in privation or deficiency of it. You can do this by yourself, tear the paper up afterwards. No one will know what your conclusions are but yourself. And actually, no one cares. The only thing that anyone else knows is that if your conclusion is correct, it will sum up to the person that they know. That is, you. It is almost impossible to make such a chart or study honestly without realizing that in some things we are too much and in other things we are too little. Therefore, we are divided within ourselves. We may have excellent business experience within a field and be hopelessly deficient in the arts and in the aesthetic branches of living. We may be one of those souls wrapped up in the deepest religious convictions of life, but we have never been able to make a practical decision correctly. We may be full of ideals and totally lacking in mental organization with which to bring them about. We may be marvelously integrated on the level of means and ends, but we have no ability to create. We find, therefore, all through society, these unbalanced persons, these gods crippled in their feet, always with a weakness, and this weakness some way standing between the person and his achievement. If he does not analyze himself, every weakness that he finds or experiences, he will blame on others. He will not recognize his own weakness as his cause, but will assume that it is unreasonable resistance from others. Energy that does not move naturally becomes sluggish, and we will blame this sluggishness upon conditions, adversity, ill fortune, and misunderstanding, when actually the energy is not moving in ourselves. We have not been able to bring into this situation a blank area which we have not developed, which we have not strengthened, and which is therefore not available to us in need. Blank elements in our personality have several effects upon us. First, they are not available energy. They represent dead spots. And in the second place, they are breaks in our area of comprehension. The dead spot in ourselves, representing a particular field of activity, leaves us out of sympathy with other persons in whom that area is developed. So we do not accept or understand types of energy or departments of learning or understanding with which we are unfamiliar. Having observed a dead spot, and we usually can find several if we look very carefully, we have a certain ability immediately revealed. If an individual has 6 fairly well organized areas and 4 dead spots, now a dead spot does not necessarily mean total absence. It means, however, that the degree of availability is utterly inadequate to the need of the occasions that arise. that the strong points in the person's nature need support from these areas, and that this support is not there. Thus the person is crippled inwardly, psychologically. He is deformed. And as the result of this deformity, every opinion, attitude, and conclusion that he reaches has certain incompleteness, certain deformity or error factor in itself. Your dead spots are the fields of potential error in judgment, in attitude, and in energy resources. If we have a fairly strong nature in certain respects, we owe it to ourselves to live toward it. Thus, if we have several abilities, it is not our privilege to sit back and enjoy them. It is necessary for us to bring up these deficient areas so that these abilities will have a complete area of energy support. If we do not build up the weak areas and continue to develop only the strong areas, we will then have tremendous imbalance and very bad areas in decision. We will not be able to estimate and weigh things correctly. Animosities, enmities, misunderstandings are due to compounds of strong and weak areas within one rational field. And wherever these areas exist, we will continue to suffer from the result of bad judgments or inadequate judgments until we correct them. And we must never assume that the 6 strong powers or faculties that we may have can overcome the weakness of those that are not developed. That we must never take it for granted that we can move victoriously on the strong and continue to ignore the weak. Because these weak areas are the heel of Achilles in this situation. They are the vulnerable areas. Others discover them almost immediately, because it is quite obvious to other people these deformities which we do not recognize in ourselves. Thus, by means of a careful classification, we can come to some very important discoveries relating to the integration of a complete individual. And the complete individual is the only safe individuality. This does not mean that we must be perfect. It means that we must be within ratio of balance, that we must arrive at the decisions of our levels from the full support of our available faculties on those levels. Thus, if we, for instance, decide that our strongest faculties represent a 7 out of 10 proportion, which is about what you might regard as proper for strong faculties, this does not mean that we have to make decisions upon the level of 10. But it means that we will be in trouble as long as strong faculties marked 7 must drag along with them weak faculties recognized as 1 or 2 or 3 degrees only in their development. 4 faculties in the 3 and 2 or even 4 balance against 6 in the 6 and 7 range will create a disposition that will make us unlivable with other people. Most folks have never thought of it that way. They have assumed that those who like their strong points must endure the weak ones. Unfortunately, however, it is much more difficult to endure the weak than it is to enjoy the strong. Therefore, recognizing these things, we must try to root out our principal inequalities and inconsistencies, and by so doing, go to work on them. The stronger faculties that we have if properly organized, will come in very handy in the development of weak ones. Because faculties, like everything else in nature, are interdependent. And there is something used from other faculties in the development of each faculty. Consequently, the strong areas will generally contribute to the strength of the weak ones if we will go to work on the subject. Ignored, however, we may never make the bridges between these different levels. One of the most common problems that we have, for example, is that the thoughtful person has developed a whole group of positive faculties, but he is nearly always deficient in his social adjustment faculties. He has tremendous power to theoretically understand life, but he simply cannot get along with another person whom he regards as stupid. We have a tendency to love to believe that we have outgrown something, and that having outgrown it, we are in position to rejoice and to look down our noses a little bit at those who have not outgrown it. Many individuals have not outgrown the things they believe they have outgrown. They have simply avoided, evaded, and walked out of them. Their so-called separateness from others is not due to greater maturity, but simply to a kind of belligerence or an overestimation of their own attainments. Only sitting down quietly can we discover what we have actually outgrown. In broad terms, however, this is certain. Anything that causes us trouble, we have not outgrown. Because once we have outgrown a problem, it ceases to exist. And wherever there is a field of problem, there is an area in which the individual is too small for the situation in which he finds himself. No one is in trouble because he is more perfect than other people. He is in trouble because he thinks he is more perfect, and because he has mistaken one or two abilities in which he may be strong for a total coverage, when these two or three isolated abilities, being greatly divided from his common nature, may actually be making him weaker than those around him through division and discord in his own nature. After we analyze these differences, we discover that for the most part they are polarized, and that nature, whether we recognize it or not, is constantly inviting us to strengthen weak areas. This form of invitation, however, is seldom accepted with pleasure. We may receive the invitation, but we misunderstand it immediately. Nature always invites us to develop weak areas by confronting us with problem in those areas. Nature is not concerned about the things we do the best. Nature wants to know why there are some things we still do very badly. And nature might want to know, and probably does want to know right now, how a civilization with thousands of years of culture and thousands of years of learning and instruction and understanding can do so many things so badly. This is the problem. And we are confronted constantly with the evidence of our own insufficiency in certain fields. But man, by nature, does not like to accept such a challenge. He does not even want to recognize it. And the moment we are confronted with an evidence of inadequacy, we try to get out of it. We try to excuse ourselves, explain it away, or even go so far in the case of fanaticism as to try to make a particular virtue out of our weakness. An individual who has many achievements but has never been able to, we will say, be generous in his thinking, with other people, tries to explain to us that tolerance is not a virtue. He doesn't have it, therefore it is not a virtue. And the reason he does not have it is that tolerance, to his mind, will force him to be gentle and kindly and understanding and accepting of things which are wrong. Therefore, that this is not a constructive attitude, but is merely supporting error, and he'll have no part of it. So he has a beautiful excuse, a beautiful explanation for everything except the arthritis that sets in. For this he has no explanation, except that probably something is wrong in the universe. The person, therefore, can go so far as to make his unadjustment a virtue. When he does this, he is very well locked in his own negation. He's going to have a very hard time. But normal, sensible people, in situations which are uncomfortable, gradually come to the realization that if they ever want to be more comfortable, they must do something about it. And from this level, they can be instructed. They can be helped. And values important to them can be communicated. So where we have these problems, we also realize that in the weak fields or weak areas, in the dead spots, in the blank areas, we likewise usually have lack of interest. This perhaps is the most paralyzing of all. It is the negative state of not really wanting to do anything with these areas. We have lived a long time without them. We have been accustomed to the deformity which they have produced. And we even go so far as to assume that any change in these will upset and disorganize the peculiar kind of uncomfortableness we are now enjoying. And many persons do enjoy their own discomforts of the moment. They're such good conversation pieces and wonderful opportunities to get together and tell how tough life can really be. Lacking interest and dynamic in a weak field, we have very little libido with which to move into it. We seem to consider that these areas are unknown. When we study them, we have small aptitude. When we are around people interested in them, we don't care whether we ever meet these people again or not. We are just negative in the fields where our own abilities have not been specialized. Whereas the things we do especially well seem to come natural to us. And we find that it requires a minimum of energy to maintain them. Thus our very laziness, our inertia, will cause us to carefully avoid areas that require unusual effort. The answer lies, however, that the energy required to assail these areas and correct them is much less than the energy which must be expanded in trying to correct the consequences of the mistakes we make. The individual, out of a poor balance, may involve himself in a life pattern that brings misery for 70 years. And it would certainly be far less energy for him to correct the pattern at its cause, and in this way relieve his life of all these pressures and all these difficulties. Lonely, frustrated, neglected people always have these dark areas in which they have not built bridges by which they were able to understand others. Now, understanding of other people is not compromise. Understanding does not mean necessarily that we approve of everything that everyone else does. Understanding, however, is a quiet sympathy by which we come to know why people do what they do, and why in these persons their action is perfectly consistent with their natures, and that their natures, like our own, are imperfect, and that the differences and difficulties belong in this unexplored area of interdependence. It is perfectly possible to enjoy persons whose natures are different from our own. It is perfectly possible for us at least to create a constructive attitude of indifference, an indifference which wishes them well, hopes them all good, and never permits us to tangle with them in irritation or dislike or even vengefulness. Such attitudes are utterly unnecessary. Now, the second pattern that will help in this is the bringing down of the situation from the generalities to more particulars. We have suggested the charting and analyzing of the total disposition of the person. The next thing we can consider is the analysis by the individual of a particular group of circumstances in his own life. He can take the immediate problems that now surround him and diagram them also. He can chart them. And the moment he puts them on paper, he subjects them to certain laws. The things he puts on paper, he will see with his own eyes. And this funny little circle between his hand and his recording and his eyes and the return to the brain again of these energies, this will make a marked difference in his relationship to life. He can hold inconsistent attitudes, but if he diagrams these and throws them into symbolical patterns, their deformities will become apparent to him. And things which he can defend with words, he can never defend with the simplest form of geometric shapes. Thus, he can diagram and plan a course of procedure by means of which he can see where his present policies are leading. He can get himself away from the pressure of the things that he feels at the moment he must do, the attitudes that he feels he must take, and try to see what this is all going to add up to tomorrow, next month, next year. And by getting a longer look, he will then recognize, to a measure at least, where the deficiencies in his own perspective are located. And by seeing these patterns unfold, as in a story involving other persons, he can discern his own place, and will often find that he is playing the villain instead of the hero. Once having discovered this, he is in a position to do something about it if he wishes to. I believe that every individual contemplating decision should not say to himself, I will by this decision immediately get out from under something. I think we should say to ourselves, out of this decision certain consequences must come. What condition will I be in a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What kind of a debt am I contracting against truth, by means of which I shall be faced with liability? Is this decision well matured, or does it arise from the most false of all factors, and that is pressure? Am I doing it because I am pressed, or am I doing this because it is right? This difference is very important. The third way in which diagramming can be of great value to us is to diagram a situation through which we have passed. Diagram the last crisis we went through. Analyze thoughtfully every factor leading up to it, that is within our estimation, analyze our own reaction to it or our lack of reaction, and then analyze the consequences flowing from this situation, so far as we are capable of knowing them. Studying this procedure is very much like the Pythagorean discipline of retrospection. It makes available to us a kind of diagrammatic picture of our own ability to handle a problem. If after the diagramming we do not find that we have handled this problem effectively, nobly, wisely, and lovingly, there's something wrong. And the fact that we have failed to handle this problem in a truly enlightened manner may not reflect against our good intention, but it does reflect against our available knowledge in the field of the problem. And where our knowledge is not at all adequate, and the problem is immediate, it may be necessary that we seek help or advice from those whose knowledge is greater than our own. But only do we seek help in order to pass an emergency, recognizing that the answer lies in making ourselves adequate. And that until we do that, the problem is still with us. From these three procedures, we can gain insight into dead areas of our own faculty, sensory, and consciousness developments. We can then begin to say to ourselves, I have gone too far in some direction or other. I have failed to take into consideration the natural needs of life. Now, it often occurs that persons will come to me with a problem of this kind, and they'll say, the place where I am gives me no opportunity to round out, to balance off these faculties. So the only answer seems to be to pick up the carcass and put it somewhere else. Normally speaking, this never does any good, because wherever we are in the middle of ourselves. And if a situation is poor and we move into another one, in 6 months that situation will become as poor as the first one. The poverty is in us, not in the situation. The proof of that is, particularly, for example, in industry, which we regard as one of the most monotonous and uninteresting of all activities. Yet a great corporation with 10,000 employees has 10,000 individuals. Each of these individuals is different. Each of these individuals has different interests. Yet they all gather during the day to provide the means of their physical survival. All of these persons are not destroyed by this so-called monotony and mediocrity. Whether a burden or a job or a work drives us to distraction is largely a problem of how easily we can be driven to distraction. And the poorer we are inside, the quicker this can happen. The individual who, attending such monotonous labors, becomes obsessed only with their monotony, will drive himself and others crazy. Another individual who says, this is my job, I have to support a family, this is the way I do it, and I'm grateful that I have some way of doing it, will probably have much less tension problem than the rebel. The individual who also, facing the fact that this type of employment is a heavy burden upon his creativity, having a tendency to create in him fatigue without variety and monotony without stimulation, immediately does that which is necessary, or at least as much as he can, to correct this by the development of outside constructive and creative interests. By degrees, he finds that if he wishes to, he can enrich other parts of his life to protect him against the monotony of his job. And the answer is that people do it. If you go through, and I've gone through lists of various employees, if you go through the group of persons employed by a company, and you compare them, this list, with the unhappiness and misery of 5 employees who are totally unhappy in the situation. You study this. You come immediately to the realization that it is perfectly possible to adjust constructively, and that the monotony which is destroying one is creating responsibility, integrity, and challenge for growth in another person. Thus it is our own internal reaction to all of these situations. We are miserable because of dead spots. And as long as we have these dead spots, we remain miserable. To get these cleared up very often requires a powerful decision. It should not. But with man today, these dead spots appear in so many patterns that the average individual cannot easily find an area in which he can gain the autocorrective environment that he needs or feels that he deserves. Therefore, in many instances, the correction of these depends upon his adjustment not with persons immediately, but with levels of activity. Persons can be a constant annoyance, but levels of activity can be continuous creative challenges which we can work with. And by gaining skill on these levels, we ultimately gain the insight which enables us to solve the individual problem. So we come to study people and observe that the excesses in themselves, always accompanied by blank spots, will ultimately tear the individuals themselves to pieces, making it impossible for them to attain the ends which they desire. Individuality is not, however, something that has to be so vigorously fought for, in danger of being submerged by the individuality of others. The only individual who can submerge us is the individual who is more than we are. All others can bluster and bluff, but they cannot submerge us. We can never be forced into servitude to inferiors. We can be brought perhaps physically under their dominion. And there are a great many persons who feel that they are very much smarter than the boss. That has been the commonest situation in life. Sometimes they are. But this does not mean servitude. It simply requires that the individual diffuse his activities, realizing that the boss cannot control the inner life of one single employee. The only way the boss can make the employee neurotic or frustrated is because the employee lets him. If, therefore, the person is smarter than the boss, he is smart enough to recognize the mistake the boss is making. Smart enough to recognize that it is not necessary for him as the individual to be hurt or injured by the boss. The child can be very difficult, and in many relationships can exhaust the patience and understanding of the parent. But actually, the parent has a wonderful power and strength in the fact that the child is dependent upon them, and that their understanding, in most cases, is greater than that of the child. Therefore, they can afford to be patient of the child, who may become the little tyrant like the child boss in the office. But the wise person is not moved by them. The wise person is able to adjust and preserve his individuality without tension. It is because of his instinctive effort to fight for his individuality that the conflict begins. You never have to fight for it. It is not something that must be defended. It is either there and needs no defense, or it is not there and cannot be defended. The effort to fight for it is meaningless. It must be caused to come into existence. And the positive cause of this is that experience and adversity in life around us, these remind us continuously of the need for the strengthening of our inner resources. And that the moment we recognize and accept this challenge, we do not turn against the pressure on the outside. We go to work building the self on the inside. And to the degree we accomplish this, the exterior pressure disappears. All things are conquered within the person, and not in resistance to and rebellion against situations around the individual. Now, there is one general exception to this rule. It is not an exception to the principle, but an exception of a different kind, as Socrates points out. And that is that every human being has within himself a divine principle. This divine principle is his God. And to this divine principle, he must be true. This obedience, or this acceptance of the responsibility of being true to truth, is a tremendous abstraction in itself. And many persons, through misunderstanding and through the blank spots in themselves, believe that they are true to truth, when in reality they are only desperately fighting for their own opinions. This becomes a very subtle factor. But truth as we know it in the world has been given to us not only interiorly, but environmentally, through the great systems of morality, ethics, and religion which have come into the world. These systems, like man, have most of them blank spots somewhere in them. But together they form a tremendous ethical, moral heritage. And those simple things, those common principles which they all together teach, form a code of value. And as Socrates points out, no individual shall be required, nor shall it be demanded of him, that he permit any external circumstance to destroy or to compromise his dedication to God or to principle. Therefore, there is no point of an individual actually trying to adjust himself to a dishonest employment, or adjust himself to a situation which in its own principle and value is not right. No one is expected or required by nature to do this. And it becomes one of the big questions of the individual on many instances, because he is forced to decide often between principle and profit. He is forced to decide to accept situations that may seem to be extremely unreasonable and unjust, or else to place himself at such an economic disadvantage that he does not know how he can carry his responsibilities. This is the one point where the individual's decision must also be morally strengthened by the sense of true value in himself. Here is also the place where that over-faculty or overpower, which we call faith, has to have its chance to operate. The average person believes that there is a power in nature working together for good. He also believes that there is in the universe a justice that is greater than the injustice of man. And a person believing in a universe that is honorable and is sincere cannot long survive the complete compromise of this conviction. Now, in the course of years, I've seen a number of persons come into this situation. I've also observed that in a great many instances, they are not actually in this situation, nor have they outgrown the very attitude which they resent in another. We have to be careful and sit down and study this one through with the greatest of care. Because the fact that we disagree with dishonesty may not necessarily mean that we are more honest. If it always did, we'd have again a clear line of demarcation. I have actually known individuals who could not get along with a dishonest employer. Yet these individuals in their daily living were also dishonest. They were dishonest in different ways, perhaps, sometimes in the real way. I knew a man years ago who spent 20 years of his life screaming against corrupt politics. He finally was elected to a small political office himself on the grounds that a man with that attitude for 20 years must have been a person of tremendous integrities. Within 6 months, he was indicted for dishonesty. The moment he got the office, he was just as dishonest as the persons that he had been blaming. So rebellion against dishonesty is not always a monument of honesty. It is sometimes, as one person actually told me, the mere fact that there was no room for his dishonesty in the larger pattern of the other man's dishonesty. It is not always just a statement of honesty. It is a problem of the individual who must decide the level of his own values. There is no use to rebel against the dishonesty of others if we are ready to compromise any moment for our own advantage. This is why so many people who try to get out of dishonest situations come to grief. And why they will then turn around and say, well, I did the right thing, I got out of the dishonest situation, and I've been miserable ever since. The misery actually stemmed from the fact that they had only gotten out of a situation that their own natures were also loaded with dishonesty. That will not work. But the person who is, to the core of his being, more honorable than his situation, and is unhappy in his situation because it is attempting to force him to compromise principles, that individual is better off to step out of the situation and trust to truth. And I've seen it happen constantly and repeatedly, and I've never seen the individual starve to death as a result. If his own nature is really there, if he is honestly stepping out because he is honest, and not because he can't take something, or not because the pressures are too great, or that he is so socially unadjusted that he must make a villain out of the situation to excuse himself. But if he is really an enlightened person with a serious determination to achieve that which is right, nature wonderfully and wisely and lovingly guards that person because he is of her own, and she will protect her own at all cost in the face of adversities. And if we have any faith whatever in our religions, we know this is true. And we have seen it operate. But it takes a little more of value in ourselves to walk upon the waters under such a condition. But it can be done and is done every day. So in our problem of individualism and the moderate exercise thereof, we have another interesting point. Immoderation of all kinds, whether it is of egoism or unreasonable self-abnegation, immoderation is the result of unbalance. The only answer to the problem of inordinate ambition or immoderate individualization is that the nature must be balanced. Balanced natures have no immoderations. These arise from strength and weakness, thrown into violent contrast. As this is ironed out and evened off, the person becomes naturally moderate and adjustable. The balance produces also essential freedom from stress, causing the person to adjust naturally to the needs of the hour. Surely he may enjoy some things more than others, but if he is a balanced person, nothing that is natural or probable or consistently occurring can make him miserable. He will also discover that to the degree that he becomes moderate, the moment he ceases to be miserable in situations, he reverses the course of energy and is instructed by these situations. When we are belligerently aggressive against everything, we lose all power to grow from situations. We lock ourselves in an attitude through which truths of many kinds strive desperately to break. They cannot get through. So any situation that is met with an aggressive or an unreasonable attitude loses its power to teach us. And the situation exists primarily for that reason only. This problem that arises is to tell us that we need to know something that we do not know. If, however, we lock ourselves in a battle with it, we lose sight of the basic need, and that is our greater insight. And very often this is a natural defense mechanism. We subjectively recognize that we are defeated by our own weakness, but we do not wish to acknowledge it. So we begin to bluster. And blustering is just a final proof of weakness. It serves no useful purpose and accomplishes nothing. Another individual will say, but blustering and a certain amount of irritation, worry, fear, jealousy, and reproach, these emotions arise within me. There's nothing I can do about them. They're there, whether I like them or not. Certainly they are there. And they will remain there while we have these dead spots. For they arise from the failure of those faculties which are necessary to prove to us on the level of demonstration that there is no cause for the attitudes we hold. If we are jealous, it is simply because of the blind spots in our own faculties. The moment we understand value correctly, we cannot be jealous. It is impossible. But to frustrate jealousy and to pour all kinds of admonitions upon us from the outside, or to try to fight it with sheer willpower, such procedures will effect no permanent good. Jealousy is inadequacy. Suspicion is inadequacy. Condemnation of others is inadequacy. These things all mean deficiency in ourselves. The solution does not lie in taking this out on someone else. It lies in the strengthening and the developing of these dark areas so we get light into them. And as we get light into them, we suddenly begin to realize why the people we do not like, someone else does like. Because these persons have likable values if we can find them. But if these values lie in areas where we are blank, We will never find them. Therefore, universal appreciation depends upon universal enlightenment. This is the theory. This is the great abstract theorem, or the hypothesis behind it. But it is preserved and sustained by every act of conduct that we know. Every inability to adjust, every blank area, the individual who goes out and says, well, I love to watch a baseball game, but a sunset leaves me indifferent. Or I enjoy television, but I would never go to a concert. Or the person says, I love to go out and work with my hands, but I cannot read a book. I've had people say all these things to me. I know one man who said and boasted for years that he had never read a book. In advancing years, he was stricken with paralysis and kept in a wheelchair. He had absolutely nothing to do because he couldn't even read. He had never recognized the fact that not being able to read was not something about which he should be proud. He boasted of it, and in his advancing years lost the companionship, as Emerson expresses it, of some of man's noblest friends, good books. So this blank spot ultimately made a greater blank in his life. When a man does not do things or have interest in things which others have found valuable, it is very possible that he is simply allowing a blank spot. Because actually, the universal man needs and knows that he needs universal knowledge. The individual must sometime be all things unto all men, and by so doing come to understand the lives of people. Understanding and ability to grasp these situations produces the most interesting individual in the world. Where everybody makes the same mistakes, the person who does not make them is the individual. Now, our idea is that if we can make them bigger and better, then we become the individual. If someone gets mad, we can get madder. Then we stand head and shoulders above the throng. This is not true. The individual becomes the individual when he becomes different by being better. The person who in the midst of an argument is in serene control of the situation, he is the individual. And wherever the true individual appears, he is a moderator. The true individual is never a person addicted to excess. This is the reason why in many fields of activity we have temporary heroes, and then we have long-range heroes. The temporary hero may make more money and have more applause today. Tomorrow he is gone. The long-range hero is forgotten, ignored, persecuted, and perhaps martyred in his own time. But 1,000 years later he begins to live, and perhaps he lives for ages in the dawning understanding, respect, and admiration of mankind. And those who have this great long-range immortality within our experience and consciousness are those whose insight is greater. Therefore, the great individual is the understanding individual. He is the person who has created the proof that man possesses within himself the individual right to be truly good. This right cannot be taken from him, but he can ignore it in himself. He cannot be prevented by anything else from achieving it, but he can prevent himself by simple deleteriousness. All of these things come into our thinking. And the process of being the moderate individual means to be the individual who is correct, who has the right answer, who has the right attitude. And often enough, if this individual does not talk all the time, He will be listened to when he does speak. And when in a few instances his rightness is obviously revealed, his leadership is inevitably established. It is not necessary for him to force his ideas on anyone. For man does possess within himself an interior apperception to value. And the person who conveys value will be respected as no one else can be. So individuality does not mean the person standing out by a valiant effort of his own. Individuality means the inner life of the individual coming of age within him, whereby he becomes free from the false values which constitute group thinking. A person might say you could be an individual by being the most selfish of all men. That would be a distinction. Like the problem of the old Greek, who wanted to be remembered in history, and he tried to think of something to do by which he would never be forgotten. So he burned the temple of Diana at Ephesus, believing that an individual who performed so terrible an action could not be forgotten. He wasn't. But it did him no good. Man can assume that he can be remembered for such causes as the Hitlers and these warriors of history. But this in itself leads nowhere. True individuality carries with it the common acceptance and admiration of mankind. The true individual is neither hated nor feared. He is naturally accepted because the balance of his own judgment is correct. Therefore, true individuality, true separateness, true individual existence is vested in such persons as Plato, who had the extraordinary ability of being more nearly right than those around him. He was not perfect, nor were all his findings perfect, but he was more nearly right. And he possessed with it the greater rightness of an enduring kindliness, a great natural affection for mankind, and an insatiable determination to understand men rather than to blame them, to know them rather than to criticize them, and to serve them through knowledge, never for a moment worrying about the possibility of being in servitude to the ignorance of others, but rather recognizing that the one who would be greatest among us should be the servant of all. And through a quiet, intense, but very natural love of knowledge, and a seeking forever for answers, man becomes truly an individual and stands out in his own world and in the world around him because he is better integrated. Not because he is made of better stuff, but because he has used this stuff more wisely. And out of this has gained not only natural leadership as nature intended, but the love, admiration, and understanding of those he leads. Out of this we have a moderation, a democracy, an independence, still interdependent. And the individual who realizes that his own happiness can only come really also through the fact that he can give happiness. And these things binding together form the individual. The real person who can stand alone in the world and be revealed as noble, as adequate, and as suitable to meet the problem of daily life. We cannot attain this end immediately, but we can work toward it with the energy that we now waste fretting, fearing, worrying, and hating. When we achieve this, we will truly be moderate individuals. Well, time's up. Now, as in the recent year or two, there have been several works arising from scientific levels dealing with the possibility of the influence of planets and stars on human life. So we're going to hit it this next week, where we haven't talked about this type of thing for quite a long time. So we're going to analyze the possible use of astrology in self-analysis, and we think it will be of interest to you. We also have the new issue of our journal on the table this morning, the winter issue. It contains a number of articles that we think will be of interest to you. Part of the lecture notes on our lecture are Other Planets Inhabited. A section dealing with the prophecies and teachings of Paracelsus will also be found in this journal. And we think we have a very interesting publication. And I seem to remember that we've brought Atlantis up to date with some interesting early maps, not generally available to the public. So we think the new issue will be valuable, and we hope you will not only secure a copy, but will subscribe. Use it as a Christmas present. Your friends will remember it and remember you 4 times a year as a result of your thoughtfulness. It is a big present for a small cost. So we hope you'll think about it. And also our other books and our Christmas booklet to use instead of a Christmas card. We think you will find that your friends will appreciate this. Our books are one of the ways in which we are able to carry on our work. So your consideration of them in connection with Christmas shopping, we think helps you. We know it will help us to carry on the work we are trying to do. So we thank you very much and hope to see you next week.